If I had known what would happen that night, I never would have taken the job. The moment I stepped into the abandoned shack, the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The map I'd found in my grandfather's attic had led me here, and now, standing in the dim light of my flashlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor creaked with every step I took. The smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic filled my nostrils. I told myself it was just an old, forgotten place or nothing to be afraid of. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I hadn't planned on coming here. It was supposed to be a quick trip to clean out my grandfather's house after he passed away. He'd always been a bit of a mystery, a man who kept to himself and rarely spoke about his past. When I found the map tucked inside an old journal, I thought it was just another one of his eccentricities, but curiosity got the better of me. The map was hand-drawn, with a red X marking this spot in the middle of nowhere. I figured it was some kind of treasure hunt, a final gift from a man I never really knew. Now, standing in this decaying shack, I wasn't so sure. The flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm to steady the beam. The last thing I needed was to be left in the dark. My heart was already pounding, and every sound the wind rattling the broken windows, the distant hoot of an owl made me jump. I tried to focus on why I was here. I needed the money. My grandfather's house was the only thing he'd left me, and selling it wouldn't cover my debts. If there was even a chance this map led to something valuable, I had to take it. But as I looked around the shack, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved deeper into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the floor, a piece of paper, crumpled and yellowed with age. I picked it up and smoothed it out, my hands trembling slightly. It was a note, written in the same shaky handwriting as the map. If you're reading this, you found the shack, but you're not alone. Follow these rules if you want to make it out alive. I laughed nervously, the sound echoing eerily in the empty space. Rules? This had to be some kind of joke. My grandfather had always had a dark sense of humor, but as I read the first line, my laughter died in my throat. Rule number 1, do not turn off your flashlight, no matter what. I glanced down at the flashlight in my hand. It's been steady for now. The second rule made my stomach churn. Rule number 2, if you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. Keep walking. I froze, straining my ears. The wind had died down, and the shack was eerily quiet. But then I heard it a faint crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves outside. My breath caught in my throat. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. But the sound came again, closer this time. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles turning white. The third rule was even more unsettling. Rule number 3, if you see a shadow that doesn't belong to you, leave immediately. Do not look back. I scanned the room, the beam of my flashlight darting across the walls. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, I saw a shadow, just out of the corner of my eye. It was too tall, too still to be mine. My heart raced as I turned the flashlight toward it, but the shadow was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I crumpled the note in my hand and shoved it into my pocket. This was insane. I should leave, forget I ever found this place. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it again, the footsteps, louder now, and coming from inside the shack. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to take a deep breath. It was just the wind, or the old wood settling. It had to be. But then I heard my name. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. My name, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, I saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I bolted, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran through the shack and out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the trees. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from that place. When I finally stopped, my lungs burning and my legs shaking, I realized I was lost. The shack was nowhere in sight, and the trees all looked the same. I pulled out the crumpled note and read the last line, the words sending a chill down my spine. Rule number 4, if you make it out, don't come back. They'll be waiting. I didn't know who they were, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I shoved the note back into my pocket and started walking, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I was being followed. I didn't stop walking until the sun began to rise, its pale light filtering through the trees. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I didn't dare stop for long. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure from the shack following me. But the forest was empty, or at least it seemed that way. When I finally stumbled onto a dirt road, I felt a flicker of relief. I didn't recognize where I was, but at least it was a sign of civilization. I followed the road, my flashlight now useless in the daylight, until I reached a small gas station. The attendant behind the counter gave me a strange look as I walked in, disheveled and covered in dirt. But I didn't care. I bought a bottle of water and a map, trying to figure out how to get back to my car. As I sat in the corner of the gas station, sipping the water and studying the map, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. I pulled it out of my pocket and smoothed it on the table, reading the rules again. They were so specific, so deliberate. Who had written them, and why? Rule number 1, do not turn off your flashlight, no matter what. Rule number 2, if you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around, keep walking. Rule number 3, if you see a shadow that doesn't belong to you, leave immediately. Do not look back. Rule number 4, if you make it out, don't come back. They'll be waiting. I shivered, remembering the shadow I'd seen in the shack. Had it been real, or just my imagination? And who were they? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. But one thing was clear. I needed answers. I decided to go back to my grandfather's house. Maybe there was something else in his attic, something that could explain the map and the rules. It was a risk. The note had warned me not to return, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just let this go. When I got back to the house, it felt different somehow. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went straight to the attic, my footsteps echoing on the creaky stairs. The map had been tucked inside an old journal, so I started there, flipping through the pages for any clues. That's when I found another note, written in the same shaky handwriting. My heart raced as I read it. If you're reading this, you've broken the rules. They know you're here. Follow these new rules if you want to survive. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I held the note. Rule number 5. If you hear someone whispering your name, do not respond. Rule number 6. If you see a figure in the corner of your eye, close your eyes and count to 10. Do not open them until you reach 10. Rule number 7. If you feel a cold breath on your neck, do not turn around. Walk away slowly. Rule number 8. If you hear knocking, do not open the door, no matter who it is. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow in the empty attic. This had to be some kind of joke, but the memory of the shack, the shadow, the footsteps, it was all too real. I couldn't just ignore this. As I read the rules again, I noticed something at the bottom of the paja's small symbol, like a twisted knot. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. I tucked the note into my pocket and kept searching the attic, hoping to find something that would make sense of all this. That's when I heard Ita's faint whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. My name, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was silent except for the sound of my breathing. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but then I heard it again, closer this time. Rule number 5. If you hear someone whispering your name, do not respond. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay silent. The whisper came again, louder now, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I turned back to the journal, flipping through the pages as quickly as I could. There had to be something here, some clue that would explain what was happening. But the more I searched, the more I realized how little I knew about my grandfather. He'd always been a quiet man, keeping to himself and never talking about his past. Now, I couldn't help but wonder what he'd been hiding. The whisper came again, louder and more insistent. I could feel my resolve crumbling, the urge to respond growing stronger, but I forced myself to stay silent, focusing on the journal in my hands. That's when I found Ita's photograph, tucked between the pages. It was old and faded, but I could still make out the image. It was my grandfather, standing in front of the shack, and next to him was a figure, tall and shadowy, with no face. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what that figure was, but I knew one thing for sure. I was in way over my head. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure from the photograph, tall, shadowy, and faceless. I kept the journal and the notes with me, reading and rereading the rules, trying to make sense of them. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Who had written these rules? And why had my grandfather been involved with something like this? The next morning, I decided to go back to the shack. I knew it was a risk the note had warned me not to return, But I couldn't just let this go. I needed answers. I packed a bag with supplies, a flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and the journal. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I wasn't going to be unprepared this time. The drive to the shack felt longer than I remembered. The forest seemed darker, the trees leaning closer to the road, as if trying to block my way. When I finally reached the clearing, the shack looked even more decrepit than before. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and stepped inside. The air was just as heavy as I remembered, and the smell of damp wood and something metallic was stronger now. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim light. The room was empty except for a few pieces of broken furniture and the crumpled note I'd found the night before. I picked it up and read it again, the words sending a chill down my spine. If you're reading this, you've found the shack, but you're not alone. Follow these rules if you want to make it out alive. I glanced around the room, my heart pounding. The rules had been right so far. I'd heard my name whispered, seen shadows that didn't belong to me. But what else was out there? And what would happen if I broke the rules? I decided to explore the shack further, hoping to find something that would explain what was going on. The floor creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I found a door at the back of the room, half hidden behind a broken bookshelf. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a nail next to it. I hesitated for a moment, then took the key and unlocked the door. The room beyond was small and dark, with a single window covered by a thick curtain. There was a desk in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. On the desk was a stack of papers, yellowed with age. I picked them up and began to read. The first page was a list of names, written in the same shaky handwriting as the rules. Some of the names were crossed out, others circled. My grandfather's name was near the top, circled in red. Below the list was a note. They are watching. They are always watching. Follow the rules, or you will end up like the others. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who were they? And what had happened to the others? I flipped through the rest of the papers, but they were mostly notes and sketches, maps of the forest, diagrams of the shack, and more symbols like the one I'd seen in the journal. There was no clear explanation, just more questions. I was about to put the papers down when I heard a faint knock coming from somewhere inside the shack. My heart raced as I remembered the new rule. Rule number 8. If you hear knocking, do not open the door, no matter who it is. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was just the wind or the old wood settling. But the knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from the door I just unlocked. I backed away, my hands trembling. The knocking grew more insistent, and I could feel the door rattling in its frame. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The knocking stopped, and for a moment the shack was silent. Then I heard a voice, faint and muffled, coming from the other side of the door. Help me. The voice was soft, almost pleading. It sounded like a woman, but I couldn't be sure. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door. I wanted to help, but the rules were clear: do not open the door, no matter who it is. The voice came again, louder this time. Please, me, I'm trapped. I took a step forward, my hand reaching for the doorknob. But then I stopped. What if it was a trick? What if they were trying to lure me in? I forced myself to step back, my mind racing. The knocking started again, louder and more frantic. The door shook violently, and I could hear the wood splintering. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the shack and out into the forest. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. I threw the bag into the passenger seat and started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure from the shack following me, but the road was empty, or at least it seemed that way. When I got back to my grandfather's house, I locked the doors and windows and sat in the living room, the journal and notes spread out on the coffee table. I didn't know what to do. The rules had been right so far, but I couldn't just keep running. I needed to understand what was happening. I spent the rest of the day going through the journal, trying to piece together the clues. There were more notes about the shack, the forest, and the symbols. Some of the pages were filled with sketches of the figure, from the photograph tool, shadowy and faceless. There were also more rules, each one more unsettling than the last. Rule number 9. If you see a light in the forest, do not follow it. Rule number 10. If you hear singing, cover your ears and hum until it stops. Rule number 11. If you feel a hand on your shoulder, do not turn round. Run. I didn't know what to make of it all. The rules seemed impossible, like something out of a horror movie. But the things I'd seen and heard were real. I couldn't just ignore them. That night, I tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. The wind rattling the windows, the creak of the floorboards, it all felt like a warning. I kept the flashlight next to me, its beam cutting through the darkness. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe. I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind outside, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the house. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight. The knocking was coming from the front door. Rule number 8. If you hear knocking, do not open the door, no matter who it is. I forced myself to stay still, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, the house was silent. Then I heard it a voice, faint and muffled, coming from the other side of the door. Please, let me in. I need help. It was the same voice I'd heard in the shack, soft, pleading, and unmistakably human. My mind raced. What if someone was really in trouble? What if they were hurt? But the rules were clear. Do not open the door, no matter who it is. The knocking started again, louder this time. The door shook in its frame, and I could hear the wood splintering. I grabbed the knife from my bag and crept into the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The knocking was deafening now, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath my feet. Please, the voice begged. They're coming. You have to let me in. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What if it was a trap? What if they were trying to lure me out? But what if someone really needed help? I couldn't just leave them out there. The knocking stopped abruptly, and the house fell silent. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard a faint whisper, coming from right behind me. You shouldn't have hesitated. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The hallway was empty. My heart pounded as I backed away from the door, the knife trembling in my hand. The whisper came again. Closer. This time, they're already inside. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. The whisper followed me, growing louder and more insistent. You broke the rules. Now, you're one of them. I slammed the bedroom door behind me and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound. The house was silent, but I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something watching me. I backed away from the door, my flashlight beam darting around the room. That's when I saw Ita's shadow, just out of the corner of my eye. It was too tall, too still, to be mine. My heart raced as I turned the flashlight toward it, but the shadow was gone. Rule number 3. If you see a shadow that doesn't belong to you, leave immediately. Do not look back. I grabbed my bag and climbed out the window, dropping onto the grass below. The night air was cold, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I ran toward the car, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. But when I reached the driveway, the car was gone. I froze, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The car had been there when I went to bed. Where was it now? I turned around, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it. Light, flickering in the forest. It was faint, but unmistakable. A single, glowing orb, floating among the trees. Rule number 9. If you see a light in the forest, do not follow it. I knew I shouldn't go near it. The rules were clear, but I didn't have a choice. The house wasn't safe, and the car was gone. I had to find a way out. I started walking toward the light, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I could see it know a lantern hanging from a tree branch. Beneath it was a path, overgrown with weeds but clearly marked. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The rules had been right so far, but I couldn't just stay here. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path, the lantern casting an eerie glow around me. The forest seemed to close in as I walked, the trees leaning closer, their branches twisting like claws. That's when I heard Ita faint singing, coming from somewhere ahead. It was soft and melodic, but there was something off about it. The notes were too high, too sharp, like a voice straining to reach a note it couldn't quite hit. Rule number 10. If you hear singing, cover your ears and hum until it stops. I clapped my hands over my ears and started humming. The sound muffled and shaky. The singing grew louder, more insistent, but I forced myself to keep humming. My throat burned, and my head throbbed, but I didn't stop. Not until the singing faded away. I lowered my hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was silent again, but I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something watching me. I turned around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw Ita's figure, standing at the edge of the path. It was tall and shadowy, with no face. My heart raced as I backed away, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. I turned and ran, the lantern light fading behind me. The path twisted and turned, and I could hear footsteps behind me, growing louder with every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The rules were clear. But as I ran, I realized something. The footsteps weren't just behind me. They were all around me, closing in from every direction. I was trapped. I don't know how I made it out of the forest that night. The footsteps, the whispers, the shadowy figurette all blurred together in a haze of fear and adrenaline. I remember running until my legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. I remember the sound of a car engine, the flash of headlights, and a stranger's voice asking if I was okay. I don't remember what I said or how I ended up in the back of their car. All I know is that I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nose. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. They found me dehydrated, bruised, and covered in scratches, but otherwise unharmed. They asked me what happened, but I didn't tell them. How could I? They wouldn't have believed me. Even now, I can barely believe it myself. I stayed in the hospital for 2 days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure tall, shadowy, and faceless. I heard the whispers, the singing, the footsteps. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. When I was discharged, I went back to my grandfather's house. I didn't want to, but I had nowhere else to go. The house felt different now, colder and emptier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I packed up what little I could and left, driving as far away as I could get. I didn't look back. I thought leaving would make the fear go away. I thought I could forget about the shack, the rules, the figure, but I was wrong. The feeling of being watched never left me. It's there. When I wake up in the morning, when I walk down the street, when I try to sleep at night, it's always there, like a shadow I can't shake. I try to move on, to pretend it never happened. I got a new job, a new apartment, a new life. But the past has a way of catching up to you. A few weeks ago, I found another note slipped under my door. It was written in the same shaky handwriting as the others. You can't escape. They're always watching. I burned the note, but the words stayed with me. I started seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any. Figures in the corner of my eye. I heard whispers when no one was around. Footsteps when I was alone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I knew better. They were still out there, waiting. Last night, I had a dream. I was back in the shack, standing in the dim light of my flashlight. The figure was there, tall and shadowy, with no face. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me. Then it reached out. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The feeling of that hand still lingering. I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried to forget, to move on, but the past won't let me go. I don't know who wrote them or why, but I know one thing for sure: they were right. I thought following the map would lead me to answers. I thought I could uncover the truth about my grandfather, about the shack, about the figure. But now, I'd give anything to forget it all, to go back to the way things were before. But I can't. The figure is still out there, watching, waiting, and one day, it will come for me. I don't know when or how, but I know it will. Until then, all I can do is follow the rules and hope they're enough to keep me alive.